Hello and welcome to Until Saturday, the Athletics College Football Podcast. I am here with Scott Docterman, Sam Kahn. I am David Ubben. If you haven't already, you need to be following us on Apple, Spotify, wherever you want your podcast. We're probably there. You can get those delivered to your device directly as soon as they're up. You don't have to be searching around. If you want to search around, that's fine. But hey, we're trying to make it easier on you. If you could also drop us a 5-star review, that'd be great. We like to hear from you, and be nice, please. And if you have a question or an interesting comment that we might use it in a future mailbag episode, we'll drop those periodically. And of course, you can check us out Until Saturday on YouTube. Subscribe to find out when new videos are published. We'll be doing lots of video content, especially once the season starts. Guys, quite a weekend. I don't know how we're going to find something to talk about. There's only a couple things. I think only 7 schools switched conferences, and 4 are looking for a new home. I think that's right. So, a lot of places to start. I think let's start here, guys. Everybody likes to play the blame game, and I think most fans, most people believe that hey, college football got worse over the weekend. Who deserves the most fingers pointed in their direction? Scott, we'll start with you.
It's got to be Larry Scott. It has to be. I mean, he inherited a league that was in great shape, a little old-fashioned, but still in great shape as the Pac-10. He got really aggressive right off the very beginning. David and I were there in Kansas City when the invitation was to turn it to the Pac-16 back in 2010. It didn't work out, but they did get a quality team in Utah, and in Colorado has kind of languished there. But ever since then, there's been nothing but incredible hubris and just horrible business moves. I mean, to get basically a skyrise studio or offices in San Francisco to the Big Ten wanted to do a wholesale sharing agreement with them where they would share games in every sport and cooperate, and they backed off of that. And then you just look over the years, they ended up blowing up a chance to have NBC and Comcast be part of their TV package. And finally, with the Pac-12 networks, they partnered with nobody, and then they got no viewership. So I think he's the one who set the entire table for the downfall of the Pac-12, made it vulnerable, made it economically depressed when compared to its peer conferences. And George Kliavkoff is just kind of there, stuck holding the knife at the end.
And you managed to not even talk about the Comcast overpayments and the conference offices. These are all when you talk about the failures of the Pac-12 over the last decade, it's a long list. Sam, who are you pointing the finger at for college football fans to get mad at?
I think it's a combination of a couple of figures. I'll start with Scott. Scott's right. I think Larry Scott and George Kliavkoff, both of the last 2 Pac-12 commissioners, I think share a lot of blame here. Scott for the reasons Scott said. Kliavkoff because of inaction, because they had a chance in 2021 after Texas and OU left the Big 12 to add Big 12 members and solidify themselves, and they chose not to. And then the Big 12 ended up being a little bit more aggressive, adding 4 new members at that time. Then when Brett Yormark came in, they got a TV deal done before going to open market, well before going to open market, which would have been 2025. They did it 3 years early, and that ended up boxing the Pac-12 out of the TV negotiations. So that's those commissioners I'll give some blame to, but also I think the TV networks have a lot of blame here because they are the ones deciding what inventory is valuable enough to keep and what inventory is not valuable enough to include in a major conference. And if TV money and TV networks were not the primary carrot dangling here, then I don't think we'd be in this situation. At most major realignment moves in the last 2-3 decades can be traced back to the chasing of TV dollars. And I think it's impossible to overlook the roles of the TV networks in these realignment discussions.
Yeah, I think I'm going to go off the board and I'm going to say everyone. I think, you look at college football, 30 years ago, whatever, 1984, when the Supreme Court decision is passed, you're basically Smeagol at that point, right? Well, now you've been chasing that TV money for a long time. You've gotten addicted to it. And if you get to the finish line and you're obsessed with this one thing and you're something sort of ugly and recognizable, a golem, if you will, then you have no one to blame but yourself. It's the same thing that these athletic departments do from day to day. When you are addicted to the money that boosters provide your program, well, then when you end up making a coach hire that maybe you don't love because they say, we're making this hire or my money's gone, well, then that's what you've done. You've sold out to the boosters and you've lost control, even though you're the person whose name's on the decision. Somebody else is making the actual decision. Well, it's the same thing at a macro level here, okay? You've sold out to the TV money. So if you want to say, well, it's not us, it's ESPN and Fox that are making all these decisions. Yeah, because you've sold out and you've allowed the TV networks to control all of college football. You've made a bunch of little micro decisions over the last 30 years. You've gotten more and more addicted to the TV money. We have to operate this way. We have to be a nonprofit. We can't make players employees. We can't share any revenue. We're going to become $1 billion business and keep money away from the players. And we have to continue living paycheck to paycheck. We can't have any coffers. Well, now we have to have, $150, $200 million budgets, but we still have to act like we're broke. This is what happens. You've been addicted to this TV money for a long time. And at the very end, you're something ugly and unrecognizable from where you were when you started. And so when you have conferences where Rutgers and Washington are together, and UCF and Utah are together, and that's obviously what happens when all of college football gets addicted to this money. You become something totally different, and it's hard to watch. But spare me, pointing to Larry Scott, pointing to the TV networks. You all did this. You've been doing this for 30 years. So I blame everyone.
And I'd also blame the fact that the product itself has not been able to sell itself. And they've had some tremendous players. I remember watching Christian McCaffrey in person for a certain Rose Bowl performance. But when you're looking at the last 2 years, they've only had 6 total Pac-12 games that have had at least 3.5 million viewers. And, sometimes the games are late at night. But when you're looking at, even the Pac-12 title game had less than 6 million viewers. And that was Utah, USC. But, Washington, Oregon, it's 3.6. I mean, that's a very low-level Big Ten or SEC game. So that's up to the commissioners, the schools, make themselves more marketable. And the viewership in that region, and then, of course, across the country, just wasn't interested enough, which is, of course, why the TV companies weren't interested enough in paying them a premium price tag.
But why is that a problem? Hold on, I'm going to interject there, Scott. Why is it a huge deal if a Pac-12 championship game gets 3 million versus a Big Ten championship game gets 7 million? Because I think it goes back to David's point, is that they've sold out for TV dollars, so that becomes the measurement of success. Why is that the measurement of success? College football has 133 FBS programs. It has 10 conferences. It isn't made for everybody for 5, 6, 7, 8 million people to watch every single major game. There are pockets of it. So I don't necessarily feel like I would put blame on the Pac-12 or its fans for this, because that not every conference is created equal and not every group is created equal. I think it's okay to exist where some conferences have 8 million people watching their games and some conferences have 2 or 3 or even less if you're in the group of 5. So I don't necessarily put blame on the Pac-12, because that's not what college football was meant to be. It's not the NFL where every game is going to get monster ratings.
Yeah, I just think I roll my eyes when we hear all of these conversations about, well, we had no choice. We have to do this. We have to follow the money. Okay, maybe right now you have to choose, but you've made a lot of little decisions over time, and not just sort of good or bad decisions, just money decisions that say, hey, TV money is what this is all about. And I think, again, fans want to go and beat their chest when, look at our SEC paychecks. Look at our Big Ten paychecks. Fans don't see that money. It does not affect fans. And this idea that and I think around the last, when realignment, the last round of realignment, the first of the modern, I guess, around that time, Scott, of 2008, 2009, when the Big Ten elected to expand, I feel like the tone and the tenor of conversation in college sports shifted, where all of a sudden fans were very aware of, our league makes this much, that league makes this much. I don't remember this at all when I was growing up. I don't remember people caring. I don't remember people knowing. And all of a sudden, that is the measure of a league. And if one league, and part of that is the gulf growing, and I understand not wanting to fall behind. But again, if somebody was in charge of this sport, you could see the foresight, and having somebody step in and say, hey, you guys, back to your corners. Let's not get into a brawl here where we become something we don't want to become. Let's just chill. And again, I really am a big believer in, I think the more we've seen, I've thought this for several years, the idea of pooling your television rights and having some sort of merit-based revenue sharing, even within the leagues. It doesn't make sense that Ohio State and Rutgers get the same amount of money from the Big Ten. It doesn't make sense that Alabama and Vanderbilt get the same amount of money. And they can say, well, rising tide lifts all boats. Okay, that's fine, but it still doesn't make sense, you know? And so the economics of college sports, we could do a 3-hour podcast if we wanted to about how none of it makes sense. And when you have a situation where a lot of things don't make sense, you end up in a place where the entire landscape doesn't make sense. And that's where we are. And I think even though things have been trending in this direction for a long time, I mean, I don't remember, I remember around 2010, everybody was talking about, it's going to be 4 major conferences, 4 super conferences with 16 teams. Well, the last, I'd say 4 or 5 years, it's been pretty clear that we're going into a 2-power league situation. It's not good for the sport, and I think in the college football, the NFL was built off of college football's popularity. College football is much older, much more established, and they've turned into something different that people obviously love. But I love the NFL. I also love college football. They're very, very different things. And I think that, naturally you're sort of evolving into something that's more and more like the NFL because that's where the TV money is. And I'm not even sure, honestly. I think there's a fear that this will backfire and people will love things less. And maybe that's true. I don't actually, that's true. I just am bemoaning the loss of something that looks different than the NFL. And I love college football for all of its regional identity and all of those rivalries. And I actually am not sure that a reckoning is coming or that a bubble pop is coming, or that when you axe out the NC States or the Texas Techs or the Oregon States and all of a sudden you don't have those people that want to watch the big time games. I'm actually not sure that that's coming, but I like that it existed and it doesn't exist anymore. And I think the sport is worse off for that. And it sucks.
Well, here's why I think TV ratings are really relevant, because it's a huge judge in interest, both locally and nationally. Because when more people watch your games, that means more people care about those games. And that directly leads to revenue, which of course then leads into the disparity among the leagues. And I think you're right, David, in that money became a big part of the issue with Jim Delaney talking about adding a 12th team. And he was very transparent, and he actually admits that he was probably wrong for being so transparent in the reasons for adding another team in 2011, ultimately with Nebraska. It had to do with just trying to get more of a national reach, the Sun Belt and the areas that were growing, whereas the Midwest was, constricting a little bit. So that was the reasons why that they really wanted to go into that path of gaining more, and I think that's why people now have turned themselves away. I mean, it all really dates back to the Supreme Court decision in the 80s, because everything was, like a soccer game. There's no offsides. It was almost communist in some respects, where, you didn't know which games are going to be on TV, and everybody got to be on TV. You could have, I remember Wichita State playing Drake. Neither team has scholarship football now being on instead of Big Ten games in the early 1980s. And I think right now what you're getting at is the revenue matters the most. That's why people are leaving these leagues instead of acknowledging where they are. And would that revenue gap, does it really matter for the West Coast schools versus the Midwest schools or the Southeast schools? I don't know. Because I kind of wonder, are they going to be recruiting in those regions anyway? And then is it, how far are you going to fall apart as long as you're competitive in football? That remains to be seen. But I think right now it's a matter of everybody wanting to make sure that they are in a place where they're not going to fall behind. And that's why I'm lamenting the loss of all those leagues. I like the regionally based leagues. You're playing the same teams over and over and over again. It mattered. When you played them now, it's going to be fewer and far between when you play these teams. But at the same time, I think there's going to be a heightened interest. I think when Oregon goes and plays Ohio State or Michigan, or USC goes to Wisconsin or Iowa City in the middle of November, I think people are going to tune in more so than they would have if it was Indiana playing those schools, even though they will, of course, too. But so I think there's going to be more interest. Same thing with Arizona schools playing in Texas and other places. But I do think it's, we also should take a shot and throw the shot glass against the wall and remember the series and the rivalries that we've lost here.
David came up with a great idea, by the way, of pooling the TV rights. Guess what? We did that 30 years ago with the College Football Association. Right after the 84 Supreme Court decision was made, the College Football Association controlled the TV rights for about 5 conferences, I believe it was. The Big Ten and the Pac-10 were not part of it. But then that crumbled because Notre Dame left and did its own deal with NBC. And then 5 years later, the SEC and the Big East struck out and did their own deal with CBS. And so then everybody was looking out for themselves. So at the end of the day, we're all right about the factors to blame here. But ultimately, I think to David's point, it's money. And it's the lack of a central power figure or czar or whatever you want to call it to look out for the greater good of the sport, to look out for the greater good of everybody. Because once it became that every conference or school was looking out for themselves and it was a race to the top of the food chain financially, that's how we ended up on this path.
One interesting question that I would like to pose, and I truly am not sure the answer to this because I think, people love money. I don't know if you've heard this, but if you ask today's administrators and you polled, I don't know, most of them, depending on the situation, certainly you'd vote one way or the other. If you're Oregon State versus Alabama, you might vote differently. But if you were able to go back in time and say, hey, if you knew that this was the end point of breaking all that up and not pulling your TV rights, would you still do it? Because I understand people wanted freedom. People wanted agency. They said, this is not a good system. We can make more elsewhere. I get that. But if you knew that it was going to become this sort of perverted, twisted version of college sports, to say nothing of, we don't have time to get into obviously all the non-revenue sports and how badly they got screwed this weekend and how bad their lives are going to be moving forward. I think that's just sort of an accepted reality that schools are what was it Lord Farquaad or whatever that said that, I believe that many of you are going to die and that's just something that I am comfortable living with or something along those lines. It's we're going to make a ton of money and all of y'all's lives are going to get worse, but sorry. Anyway, I'm curious what they would think if they knew that this was the end point, because, for me, it seems obvious that the sport is worse now, but it's probably a more valuable property just for a fewer amount of people. So, I'm wondering if I'm just shouting at a cloud or telling people to get off my lawn when I sort of long for the wistful days of the Southwest Conference and the Big 8 and the Pac-10 and on all these things. But I love college football because of the regional identity, because of the diversity of scheme. And when you watch a Pac-12 game and an SEC game and a Big 10 game, they all looked very different. They're different sports. They're different types of people. And I don't know. I want to say that if they went back to 1984 and said, hey, maybe we should change the rules, but keep this thing pooled, I want to say that they would do it differently, but I'm not sure. I think I just, am frustrated that they've wanted to pretend to be nonprofits while the money has exploded and got addicted to the money. And now you literally can't afford to have your money go down or have another school or another set of schools make $15 million more than you. And the fact that gap exists is crazy. And I think, again, pooling rights and a merit-based system makes a lot of sense, incentivizing winning. But, we're through the looking glass now. It's too late.
Well, the funny part is that in that Supreme Court decision, both the Pac-12, Pac-10, and Big Ten filed amicus briefs on behalf of keeping the status quo. They wanted to keep it that way. It was, Oklahoma through the Big Eight, and it was Georgia through the SEC, and Notre Dame was very instrumental in breaking this apart. And then in the immediate aftermath, the Pac-10 and the Big Ten became partners for several years as far as working together for TV rights. Work that way. The Big Ten in 1988 was the first one to have a grant of rights to the center, and it hurt some of the schools that you wouldn't think it would hurt. Back then, basketball rights were very comparable to what you got with football rights. Iowa had the most incredible network, financially lucrative network there ever was. Indiana was very close to that. Illinois and Purdue were as well. Michigan couldn't get its basketball games on in Detroit. So it was actually pulled more so from Michigan and Ohio State, and some of those schools pulled away from Iowa, Purdue, Indiana, especially those three, to make sure that everything was shared equally, because Iowa actually made more money than they did. Now you're seeing it kind of flip, obviously, in the other direction. So I think that there were ways that CFA was another one. There were ways to make this probably more manageable in the past. But once everybody started to break away and capitalism took reign, I think we're in that stage. The one thing that I do think, I'm not in favor as much of merit-based, because I saw that firsthand, and I'm sure David, you did, and I know Sam, you did, in the Big 12, and just some of the discrepancies between at that time Nebraska, Texas, Oklahoma versus the other schools, and how that became such a combative issue at times over who had more TV games and what have you. And I think if that was to happen in the Big 10, it never has before, because it's been around since 1896. But if that was, then I think that could lead to a breakup in a generation or two, to where Ohio State, Penn State, Michigan, maybe some others decide, you know what, I think maybe it's time that we broke off on our own. We're too busy making all this money, and we're carrying around some dead weight.
It's one of those reasons. By the way, we're going deep on a history lesson here.
Yeah.
The unequal revenue share in the Big 12 is a big reason we had the Pac-16 fiasco in 2010, because the schools that there was 50% was divided equally, and 50% was divided up based on TV rights. And so it created discrepancy between the teams that were always on TV and the teams that weren't. And so, yeah, I think it's a little bit tricky to kind of, back to David's point. I don't know. I think if you go back and tell them in 1995 that this is what we would end up doing, yeah, I think there would be a lot of fear, and maybe they would think twice. But I don't know that there was any other way, because before the NCAA's control of TV rights was broken up, I think you were only limited to 3 TV appearances a year. Mm-hmm. And there's no doubt that TV money and television exposure has greatly enhanced the health of the sport at large and the visibility of the sport. So that's the double-edged sword, is while it has affected these conferences and it has affected the traditional rivalries and the regionality that we love, it has also made it into the lucrative sport and the entertainment product that we know it today. Because guess what? In 1985, I couldn't go watch Texas State football on TV, but now you can watch Texas State football on TV, or you can watch, Coastal Carolina. You can watch all these teams that wouldn't have been readily available because of the way it was restricted back then. So I think it's hard to say, could you have taken some other steps? Sure. And I think probably the CFA, if it had existed and sustained, we probably could have been in a better place. But I think we did get down a path that, like Scott said, once conferences started breaking out on their own and the College Football Association dissolved, I think it was really hard to stop this train from where it was. And I'll go back, when we go back to the blame scale, the biggest schools, because what started this round of realignment, Texas and OU leaving the Big 12, because we had some silence there on the realignment train for a little while there. And then Texas and OU made the move to the SEC. And then USC and UCLA made the move to the Big 10. And I think when those programs that are major programs and tent poles of their conferences decided, well, being the tent poles of our conference isn't enough, that's when it sended everybody into the scramble.
I'd have to go back and and have a history lesson on a lot of the complaints about the CFA, but I feel like in the current market where you have a lot more cable networks, a lot more readily available streamers, whether that be ESPN Plus or whoever you want to do, there's so many platforms to put games on that it's not just 3 networks anymore, and I feel like that the idea of pooling TV rights and being able to make everyone happy enough is realistic. But, we're sort of through the looking glass. Let's turn the page from the past into the future at this point. I think the biggest, most pressing question is you have the reigning Pac-4, Stanford, Cal, Oregon State, Washington State. If you are them, and I'll start with you, Sam, what's your best move here?
That's a great question. I think if you can grab a life raft onto the Big Ten or the Big 12 or even the ACC, as ridiculous as it seems from a geographic standpoint, if you can grab a life raft there, I think you do it. I think the next option is, can you backfill and can you reconstitute your conference as it is? Certainly there's an option to go, like if you're Oregon State or Washington State, to go to the Mountain West, but is that really going to be the right move? Or is it better to try to get Mountain West schools to come to you? I don't know. And that's what makes it so difficult for these schools, is because they're kind of in a tough spot. And I don't know how plentiful their options are at this point. And it's scary. We talked about the Southwest Conference. It reminds me of the position that Houston, TCU, SMU, and Rice were in back in 1994 when this all happened. And then I think TCU, SMU, and Rice ended up in the WAC. Houston ended up in newly formed Conference USA. And I can tell you the lost revenue from a media rights standpoint compared to their counterparts who went on to the Big 12 is massive. We're talking hundreds of millions of dollars. I was adding it up the other day. If you took Houston and Texas Tech, who are, I would say of a comparable size and profile when it comes to public schools in Texas, from 2005 to 2022, the difference in media rights revenue was like more than $300 million between those two, of what Texas Tech took in versus what Houston took in. So it's massive. So this is a critical time for those 4 universities to figure out what their next step is and to land in a place where the drop in media rights revenue isn't going to be so devastating. And I don't know how possible that is. I hope they do. I hope they do, because those are fun. Oregon State and Washington State are really fun programs. Cal and Stanford have some great reputations. Stanford, one of the most successful athletic departments as a whole in the country. And I was talking about this yesterday. Remember how good Stanford was, especially in the Jim Harbaugh era. Andrew Luck going to the Heisman Trophy finalist, them upsetting USC. I mean, this is Stanford. Yes, they've been down lately, but this is not a bad program. So I hope they are able to figure something out.
Yeah, I was actually texting with a couple of administrators over the weekend, and one of them we were talking about, this is a bad time for Stanford to not be good at football. And this is as low as they've been probably since the pre-Harbaugh era, the program that he took over, because, Bryce Love, Christian McCaffrey, Toby Gerhart, the Harbaugh-Shaw era. You'd have to go back, but I mean, they were, certainly one of, if not the best program, in the Pac-12 for a good year. I mean, a good decade there, from USC to Oregon. I mean, they were right there with them, for quite a while. Once USC fell off when Pete Carroll left, so it's a bad time. And I think the interesting thing that, not all of those 4 are created equal. I think if you're Stanford, the idea that Stanford could somehow get a ticket to the Pac or to the Big Ten is not insane to me. Although TV networks control all these decisions, it is still university presidents that are actually voting and are actually the ones that you sort of have to whip the votes for. And if you're sitting around a room and you say, hey, fellow college presidents, how do you feel about Stanford coming and joining the party? That's going to be very attractive to some people. I think as much as these have become sort of craven football money factory-driven decisions, there is still like a flicker of academics still in there. The college presidents and CEOs, again, they're still the people that are making these decisions. So I think the odds are probably against that happening. But if it did happen, I'm not sure that I'd be floored. I think if I'm those four, I think my focus is looking at the Mountain West and saying, okay, who are the most valuable properties and what is the right number? Is 8 the right number? Is 10 the right number? Is Boise going to bring in something? What about San Diego State? What do you do? I think that's where I'm going. I think I'm going a little bit of a smaller league, even though that might leave you vulnerable in the future. You have to sort of make the most of what you're doing here. It's a lemonade out of lemons situation. Do the best that you can. I feel like a smaller league makes a lot more sense than saying, throwing your hands up and saying, all right, Mountain West, come get us. So we'll see. I think that's where I would probably go if I was those four.
It's a really interesting situation, as you said, because a year ago I was talking to a couple of Big Ten administrators about Stanford and Cal, because that got brought up substantially after USC and UCLA, because they have a history. They're in the same state. In fact, when the Pac-12 went into divisional play and they split, the Bay Area schools went to the north and the LA schools stayed south, they mandated that they had to play one another every year. They were just not going to just rotate in a normal fashion. So that became kind of an interesting angle. But talking to Big Ten administrators last year, it was like, we don't have interest in Stanford and Cal, even though academically they're awesome. It's just the matter that they are that we already work with them in the AAU. So there's no real need for that to work together in the Big Ten and its academic consortium. That said, when you get to this point and you maybe tug on the heartstrings a little bit of some of those administrators at Northwestern, at Michigan, and all the other elite institutions, and you say, look, we're leaving out Cal Berkeley and Stanford? Really? You're going to leave those two out to dry? It would not surprise me at all if there's either some sort of a life raft tossed in its direction, or if there's some sort of workable agreement. And this might be something I would consider if I was Stanford or Cal, is we understand that we're not going to be able to get in the Big Ten, but can the Big Ten help us out? Maybe agree to 2 games a year, 3 games a year, so we can have, whether it's USC, UCLA, maybe a Midwestern-based Big Ten team come out and play us annually in a home and home or something to that effect. I think that might help, but this is really a tough situation, because if Cal and Stanford, unfortunately, when you look at attendance, when you look at TV ratings, they just don't move the needle, even though program-wise, Stanford, as you said, was a tremendous program for about a decade. And Cal has had its moments too, and it's the University of California. So this is a really interesting situation. But I do think that maybe an 8 or even a 7-team league might be the best bet for them to say, let's go get Boise State, San Diego State, maybe even Air Force or UNLV.
I was wondering about Air Force.
Just some of those teams that can kind of consolidate. You don't need to get all of them. You don't need San Jose State in the Pac-12, but you could go back and be the Pacific Coast Conference, get those, then maybe get Gonzaga, for basketball, and kind of float a little bit more that way.
You could see if Gonzaga's basketball team wants to also play football. 2 birds, 1 stone. I'd like to see Chet Holmgren run a post route. Why not? Let's do it. Let's briefly hit on the field. There's so many moving parts, and we'll open this up. Well, we'll punt on Texas and Oklahoma because it's too far in the rear view. We'll keep USC and UCLA in the conversation. But when you look at, you have Oregon, Washington, USC, UCLA going to the Big Ten. You have the trio of Utah, Arizona State, and Arizona going to the Big 12. Of those 7 schools, who do you think upgraded their future prospects the most, and who downgraded their future prospects the most by making this switch on the field?
I'll start with the upgrading is, I think the schools that are going to the Big 12, Arizona, Arizona State, Colorado, and Utah, because the Big 12 does not have a real dominant power once Texas and OU leave. A lot of these teams are going to be operating in the same budget stratosphere, and the competitiveness from top to bottom is going to be really close. When you get Colorado back into recruiting the state of Texas, which they did heavily in their Big 12 era, I think that's going to help them. Utah already has recruited the state of Texas quite a bit and very successfully have gotten some really good players out of the state of Texas. Being now in a conference with schools in that state is going to only help them. Arizona State has got 2 dynamite recruiters on their staff with Texas ties, Rashad Samples and Brian Carey, and that's going to help them. Arizona obviously is a little bit building up. Arizona State have been down, so they're building up. But I think they enter a league where it's wide open. Like, yes, TCU went to the national championship game. Kansas State won the Big 12, but there's no one program that you look at in the Big 12 right now and say that's going to be the team that takes control of this conference. I think it's wide open for the taking, and I could very easily see Utah coming in and having a major impact in the Big 12 right off the bat.
Yeah, I think I point to the Arizona schools for all the recruiting reasons that you pointed to. The one thing that I think is sort of a fallacy is like, I've heard this conversation that like, oh, well, we can get a hand in Florida now because UCF is a Big 12. No. You have a Texas pipeline now. If you're Utah and you're Colorado and you're Arizona State and Arizona, I think the Colorado fans are going to be mad at me for leaving them out. But to be fair, that happened like a month ago. I don't even remember that, right? No, but you have that pipeline. And also Colorado, I feel like they've like I can see them in both. It's not weird. Obviously, it's not weird to think about them in the Big 12 or the Pac-12. I thought they made sense for both of those leagues. But their move, like sort of being independent of anyone else on both sides, sort of outrunning the guillotine to the Pac-12 and then back into the Big 12. Shout out to Colorado, man. They've been making very interesting moves and not getting any sort of blame or any sort of blowback from any of these decisions that they've made, and have been making decisions that have benefited their school. So props to the Buffs. But yeah, I think those Arizona schools can, and you're not playing in a league anymore, like you said, with a USC, with an Oregon that's playing with a different talent level than you are. I think that's the new Big 12 is going to be like absolutely fire, like just because the talent level is so equal across the board that there's not going to be. I mean, the preseason polls. I want to chart the Big 12 preseason poll the next 5 to 10 years because it is going to be all over the place. And then, the postseason standings, they're going to be all over the place, just because the margin of error and the difference in the roster from the number 1, number 2 team to the number 10, 11 team, maybe even further down than that, is going to be really, really, really small. And it's going to be, one of the most entertaining leagues for sure. So I'm going to point to the Arizona schools.
I think one thing about this league is it's going to be the most exciting league, I think, of all of them. I'm not saying that's going to be the best, but I think the most exciting. When you're looking at, whether it's the group of 5 teams coming in, Cincinnati recently had its moment. UCF has had its moment. TCU and Utah were former G5 teams that have had great seasons. TCU making it all the way to the championship game. Utah twice now has won the Pac-12 title and been in the Rose Bowl. And then you look at some of the holdovers, if you will, Kansas State, Iowa State, Oklahoma State. They've all had really good teams over the years, and it's going to be a wide open, crazy league. BYU's been good. Houston's been to major bowl games. So there's a lot of fun that's going to be attached to this league. And I think Arizona State, and Colorado have probably improved their lot a little bit because they're with teams and schools that are kind of where they are. When you look at the 4 going to the Big 10, I think it's interesting because it could be really difficult for them. And it's not just because they're entering a league where there are some elite powers, and then there are teams that are kind of sneaky, really good, and you don't want to go to Madison in November. It's not easy, or Iowa City at night, or Michigan State, or whiteout at Penn State, and you're going across the country, and you're going to have to go across the country multiple times. And we've seen like USC, what happened to its defense last year? What's going to happen in Big Ten when it gets just ran on? I mean, I did see UCLA. Nobody will believe this unless they look up the box score, but I saw Iowa put 49 on USC a couple years ago. So it does happen. And I think that going across the country, playing those games repeatedly, it's different than going once. Like Oregon to Ohio State for a big noon kickoff a couple years ago. It won that game. It played really well. But to do it over and over and over again, I think they're going to have some significant challenges, except for the years when they are incredibly elite.
Scott's
okay. I just looked that up. Hold on.
Games.
49 points. I just looked that up. I did not realize that. 2019.
Is that a 3-game series?
No, man. They had a wide receiver score 3 different ways in the same quarter. I mean, they scored like on their first 5 or 6 possessions touchdowns. So
you're talking about the NCAA video game, correct? You did this, Scott.
Yeah, this is
Nate
crazy,
Stanley threw for 313 yards. 49-24 Iowa. That is amazing.
Maybe Brian Ferentz isn't so bad, huh?
Well, there were years where they averaged 32 points a game, and then there was last year. I will say this, and I won't get in too far and deep with Iowa. Nate Stanley threw 68 touchdown passes in 3 years. The last 3 years, they've thrown 28. So maybe Nate Stanley wasn't so bad. So.
Well, ultimately, I think when we're sitting here and we're talking about these leagues and looking forward, for me, I think people are sort of sleeping on UCLA as a loser in all this. In terms of life got a lot harder. UCLA, they've won 10 games 5 times since 1989. I don't know if you're aware of this. Never won 11 games. They read to me like the Michigan State in some ways of the Pac-10, Pac-12, whatever you want to call it, Pac-4. And you're always a good program, but you're always kind of looking up at somebody. And it usually is 1 to 2 teams. Sometimes it's Stanford. A lot of the time it's USC. Sometimes it was Oregon. Now you're going to the Big Ten. You're not going to ever be better than Ohio State and Michigan. You still have USC. Oregon's still there. In a lot of years, Washington might have a better roster than you. When's the next time UCLA is going to win 10 games? If Dante Moore is Superman, maybe it happens soon. But now you're going across the country. You're going to be playing in cold weather. I'm sure, listen, when your primary recruiting base is California, people joke about it. But, if they have to play a snow game in November, that's not great. I don't like your odds if you have to go to Iowa City and go play in 20 degrees. Iowa's going to have a distinct advantage. Some might say a decided schematic advantage if we want to go down that road. I think UCLA, you are in a situation where now you are playing with a lot more big boys. And I think having those peak years is going to get harder for them. So people are sleeping on UCLA as I think a team that I think is going to come out in not a great place on the field as you join a league with a lot more superpowers.
Yeah, I'm in agreement. I think they look to me kind of going into this year like they're the Maryland of the West Coast. I mean, Maryland has some great talent, but Maryland just cannot get over the hump in the East, and they're not real great against the West teams either. So I think UCLA has shown that it's been competitive at times, but a lot of times it's not. And I think going to these games, as you mentioned, I was at Minnesota last year, and it was the middle of November. If they've got to go there, might as well just forfeit. I mean, that's not an environment you want to be in on the sideline.
I hate the cold. I would forfeit.
It was the most miserable. I was out. I'm like, I got to stand on the sideline for this for a while. And I'm like, oh my God, it was like -1 and the wind was gusting and it was just miserable. So I can't imagine somebody from USC, UCLA going there and enjoying that environment. So I think that they're gonna struggle, and I do think that adding Oregon and Washington does provide a little bit of a lifeline for them for scheduling instead of having to go across the country 4 or 5 times a year. Now my guess is that they'll all be kind of deemed permanent opponents. So then the years when they are scheduled to have 5 road trips, that it's actually only 3 instead of 5, because then they'll be going to say USC and Oregon or Washington on those years. So that'll lessen it a little bit, but it's it's gonna be an uphill climb, I think, for UCLA. And we've seen those horrible pictures at the Rose Bowl and how that's kind of fallen apart, attendance wise. I think it'll be better because there's a lot of transplants out there, but I think they're going to struggle, no question.
Well, if I'm Chip Kelly or I'm Lincoln Riley, I'm getting Dilly Bardan on the line. I'm bringing him in as a cold weather consultant, and I'm getting these boys in shape this offseason. We're gonna build a giant freezer, and we're gonna have to run some routes in camp. It's like when teams prep for the triple option teams. Same concept, all right? Indoor facility. We're looking and seeing what are the structural limits of our air conditioning system. Can we get it in the 30s? You have all that Big Ten money. I don't want to hear you complaining about air conditioning bills. You got it. You can do this. So there are ways around this. Let's think outside the box. As we look to the future of the landscape on the whole, I think a question that you sort of saw it start to get broached, but the way that qualifying for the college football playoff is going to happen was sort of set, and now it's not going to be set in the 12-team playoff. Mm-hmm. If you could draw it up from scratch, Scott, I'll start with you here. How do we handle this in terms of how you get in and what the specifications are? Because does the Pac-8, Pac-12, Mountain West Pacific Conference, do they deserve an automatic bid? I think most people would probably say no at this point. But what do you do?
I think you still have to extend an olive branch to the smaller conferences so you don't become like a cartel or something like that. But I think you probably drop it to 5 and 7, 5 automatic qualifiers and 7 at-larges. And, the Big Ten and the Pac-12 and the ACC and the Big 12 will all be teams that probably almost get automatic bids. And then I think you have a number 5, whether that's some years it could be the Sun Belt, other years the Mountain West that get an automatic spot. I think that's probably the fairest way to do it. I mean, I'm sure Big Ten and the SEC would say, hey, let's just have the top 12. But I think that's in some ways too subjective. I think you want to have some sort of qualification if you can for teams that actually play in a conference, because then it's too easy for the SEC to say, we're in the SEC, it's the toughest conference. Our 5th best team is better than the Big 12's first team. And, I think you should still have some sort of qualification process, but I think you got to cut at least cut 1 off the automatic qualifier list, because the Pac-12 or Pac-4 or whatever isn't going to be part of it.
Well, there's one thing we know about the SEC and the Big Ten is that they're going to be very generous, just very giving, not selfish at all. So I think that's something that we should definitely expect from them, is that how can we help you, I think, is where the conversation will start for the SEC and the Big Ten. Sam, how do you see this playing out?
Yeah, I have a feeling that we're probably going to end up where Scott said is, well, I saw Heather Dinich, who covers the playoff for ESPN, I think broached this topic either last night or this morning, the idea of possibly cutting down the automatic bids from 6 to 5 and going 7 at-larges. I can live with it, I guess. I don't love it. I would rather leave it in the format that we have it at 6, because I don't have a problem with conference champions and non-power conference getting a bid. To me, if you're going to purport to be the championship of FBS football, then I think there's a legitimate argument for a qualification mechanism for every conference. And I would not have and now of course you'd have to expand it to get to this point, but I'd have no problem if every conference in the FBS had an automatic bid. Just like they do in the NCAA tournament in Division I, every conference has a bid. So
we got to get Ari on this podcast to scream at you after that.
Well, and here's the thing about that. Ari and Max and I talked about this on Sunday on our live show of Until Saturday, and I made the mea culpa that the championship and the national champion and how we determine it. I can't speak all of a sudden. That has become probably too important to the sport at this point, because for a long time, and I'm a proponent of, like I said, a larger playoff, because I think all those schools should have access point. But I am afraid of where we've gone to the importance of it, because it used to be, okay, we had two teams play for the national championship, but then if you won the Rose Bowl, or if you won the Cotton Bowl, or even you made it to a bowl, different measures of success for different programs meant something special. And the bigger the playoff comes, the more important it becomes, the more we lose that. And the more it becomes championship or nothing. When you have a sport with 133 FBS teams right now, it's impossible for everybody to get there. So I am afraid of how that's happening. But at the same time, in order to keep things from getting so lopsided, I'm torn between, how much access do we give versus losing the soul of the sport, which I guess in some ways we kind of already have. But to Scott's point and your point, I think we'll end up with fewer qualifications automatically. And I'm totally fine with the 6-6 and sticking with it. I don't think there's anything wrong with that.
Yeah, I think if your biggest concern, or the thing that you're most interested in college football, is who won the national championship or the national championship race, dare I say, I don't think you actually understand the allure of college football. It's like Nirvana fans, or claiming yourself to be a Nirvana fan. But dude, the thing I love most is like, dude, they're so loud on "Smells Like Teen Spirit." Like it's like the best thing. Like I don't think you actually really get like what we're doing here. Like so, like yes, the national championship race is great. It's cool. You know, the loud parts of "Smells Like Teen Spirit" are cool and all that. But like, there's a lot more to this whole operation that you should try to get to know. So yeah, the national championship will sort itself out. At the end of the day, college football doesn't really have Cinderellas. Like I'd have to go back, but like, how many times have we crowned a national champion where you could say, was that the best team this year? It happens like every other year in college basketball, but like college football, it's pretty much the best team every year. There's a few times where you could maybe make a case otherwise, but like, it's so hard to get there. And I don't think that's going to change however we sort out who gets into the playoff. But I want to see more faces and access to the playoff. I think is very, very important for the future of the sport. And I do, I'd like to keep as many of those auto qualifiers as we can. I wouldn't go as far down as 10, Sam, but I think there is a value in saying every conference race matters. I think you keep people invested in that way. When, hey, you know, I can see the way. I don't think the Pac-10 is the best, or whatever the Pac becomes is the best example of it. But I think there's something to be said for, hey, you can discount us as a league, but like our champion still gets in, and our championship game matters, and our championship race and getting there, it affects the playoff race. I think there's value in that, and keeping this a national sport. So, I don't know that we need to have the MAC championship hold the same value unless you have a team. The thing that always made me mad about college football is that for like, especially in the playoff area, is that like 50 of the teams, you could win all your games, and it probably didn't matter. You need to get
that drove me nuts.
Get a lot of breaks. That's like so anti-sports, anti-American. It's anti like everything cool about like why people play the sport. So that I think we have done away with, and that is a positive. So if Buffalo goes 8-4 and wins the MAC, I don't think we need to worry about getting them in the playoff. But if Oregon State, becomes breaks loose and is 10-3 and wins the playoff, or wins the Pac-12, whatever, the Pac-8, whatever we want to call this, whatever this league's going to become, I kind of still would like to see them
100%.
Or San Diego State or Boise or ends up doing it. I kind of like to see that. So we'll see.
A couple of things I would love to see would be a Champions Week among the group of five, and maybe make it where their conference championships are held Thanksgiving weekend, but then the Champions Week is the first weekend in December, where maybe it's the champions for each of the group of five, and they have matchups, and then that way the winner of the ultimate winner goes to the playoff, and that could be like the Mountain West champion versus the Sun Belt champion, or the American. I mean, the American's been depleted, something like that. And I think people would actually like, oh yeah, I'll definitely watch that.
More good football games.
Well, yeah, exactly. So I think that's something that, nobody will complain about. So that would be something I would really be interested in.
Scott, I think you accidentally invented college football bracket busters, which, like the Pac-12, no longer exists. So, well, guys, we're going to be talking about this for a long time. I think a lot of the questions that we posed today, we're going to have the answers. become a little bit clearer over time, possibly, maybe. But college football is entering a new era, and it's sad to me. I think that's my overwhelming emotion of the last weekend. It's just I'm sad. I'm going to miss what college football was, but I'm not going to stop watching the games. I'm going to love a lot of these big games. And I wrote a column about this when the SEC announced their schedule. To quote the great philosopher Taylor Swift, I'm the problem. It's me, I believe. I hate all of this. And yet I'm going to watch every game. I'm going to watch Penn State, Oregon. I'm going to watch Utah, Texas Tech. Sorry. And I think a lot of people are like that. And I think that's a lot of the reason why this is happening. So, fellas, I'm looking forward to chronicling it with all of us, our staff here at Until Saturday and at The Athletic. We've had some great stuff over the weekend. Scott, you've written a lot of good pieces about the Big Ten and its future. Sam, you did get some good job reporting. I wrote about winners and losers and all of this. So go read our stuff at The Athletic. We've written a lot over the weekend, usually until the season happens. We're not doing a ton on Saturdays and Sundays, but I think some of us did this week. So thank you guys for listening. Again, subscribe to Until Saturday on Apple, Spotify, all the podcast purveyors, all that stuff. Leave us a review, a comment, subscribe to us on YouTube. Again, thank you guys for tuning in. Thank you guys for paying attention. It's going to be a bumpy road, but we'll be here to get you through it. Looking forward to, I'm sure there won't be any more realignment moves. I'm sure none of this will trickle down to the smaller conferences. For Scott Docterman, for Sam Conn, I'm David Ubben. Thank you guys for tuning in. We'll see you again soon.